and then we will go live. Okay. Last time Bethany and I did this, I didn't realize I was live. It was saying, you know, preparing to go live. And I was sitting here going, it's about to go live. Let's see. Here to news feed. Next. I want to make sure that we are set to public. Okay, here we go. Let's see, add a title.
All right, it says it's now streaming live.
Awesome. Yay. Hey, everybody. Sorry that we were a little delayed. We're about 20 minutes late, and that's my fault. A little bit of technical difficulties, but we're happy that you're all watching, and I hope I hope you've gotten the book, but if you haven't, we're going to be talking with Kaye Ratliff today, and she has written a book of poetry, and it's called The River Running Through Him. And it's got a beautiful cover. Did you take this picture?
No, the cover picture was done by June Witherspoon.
Oh, wow.
Of course, a fantastic photographer. Also, the author picture was done by June Witherspoon. So I'm very appreciative of her help.
Yes, I love her photography. And there's the author photo. Very nice. So everybody, this is Kaye Ratliff, and Kaye Ratliff is a local poet. She lives here in Wadesboro, and I've known Kaye my entire life. And I don't know if you remember this, but when I went through confirmation at church, you were actually the sponsor from the session that kind of met with me and talked with me and about my faith journey. And I've always remembered that. And now I'm on session.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a circle of life thing.
Right, it is indeed. And there's some of that in the book.
Yes, there is. There really is. So April is Poetry Month. And so when I was trying to think of programming, I immediately thought about Kaye's book. And I had not read it yet when I decided to do this, but I thought, well, since it's Poetry Month, it would be a wonderful addition as an adult program. And so I asked Kaye, and you agreed. Thank you for that. And I got a book, picked it up one day at church, and before I even left church in the parking lot, I went ahead and I read the first poem. And then I kind of looked at the table of contents, and I saw that there was a poem about Katie, which is your granddaughter, and we all love Katie. And so I went ahead and read that poem as well, and I'll go into it later. But then maybe that Monday or Tuesday of that week, you came by the library and we're doing curbside, and I can't remember what you came for, but you came for something. And I told you that I had read the first poem and the one about Katie, and you were like, okay. And I might not get the wording right, but you basically said, poetry should be sipped, not gulped.
Right.
Read it with like as if you know you were having a fine wine. Read it slowly, let it digest.
Right.
And I really took that to heart. And this is a lesson that I need in my life in general, especially when it comes to sweets, because I just gobble them up.
Right.
So I went back and I started to slow down. So I would read like 2 to 3 poems a day. And I would get home from work and I'd have my cup of lemonade and I would just sit down and just enjoy it. Some nights before I'd go to bed, I would read a couple of the poems and I tried to take your lesson to heart. And I agree with you. I think that's how poetry should be read, and is something that in general, I always, not just with poetry, but with everything, whether it's food or sweets, it's so much better when you really digest it. So I appreciate you telling me that.
Thank you. I try to read at least 1 poem a day. I'm an avid lover of well, I devour books. I read avidly, voraciously. But with poetry, I read at least 1 poem a day, and usually right before I go to bed. So.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of poetry, that's one thing after reading the book, it's clear that you love poetry. So could you tell us a little bit about how you came to love poetry and why do you love poetry?
Sure. My grandmother and my mother were lovers of poetry, and they were forever spouting off poetry, poetry they had memorized. My mother used, as a young woman, as a young girl before I was ever born, used to do recitations. She was of the era of Downton Abbey, that early 19th, early 20th century time. She was born in 1912. So that was a time when people read a lot of poetry and loved poetry, and poetry went out of fashion for a long time as general reading. But in college, I took a course under Fred Chappell my senior year. I was a psych major, but I was enjoying my English department electives more than I was my psychology courses. And so my senior year, I got brave enough to take a semester, my last semester under Fred Chappell on modern poetry, and fell in love with Yeats and William Carlos Williams and Robert Frost. And so that began my earnest love, my personal love of poetry. And through the years, I'd dabble, I'd get inspired to write a poem every now and then, beginning in college. And you see the first 2 poems in the book were the best I could glean from those early years. And then, periodically I get inspired to write a poem. But I kept reading it.
Here, my light went off in here. It's a motion light. So going to the book, you talked about how the first poem in the book, it was 1968. Yeah. And you do, with each poem, you tell us what year you wrote it.
Right.
And so I wondered, why did you choose to do that?
Well, you'll see that through the first poem, through the poem called November Rain. It's just that it's a flowing, it's a life flowing. The theme of the book is basically the way things we encounter in our life shape us, just as a river shapes the contour of the land. And so that's how I began and planned on ending the book, but my publisher came back and said, I need a few more poems. And so I threw together some more there at the end that were not in the flow, because it would have cost a fortune to reset. So we ended up doing that, but that was the intent. to begin with early years through young marriage and motherhood on until the latter years of life, which I'm in, and how that's still being shaped by my experiences.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I enjoy, I mean, like I said, Katie's song was the second poem I read, and I read it before I even left the parking lot. But I loved how you kind of touch on that whole, and this is what poetry does. It touches on emotion and being in the moment of any situation, but how that line where it's enchant us a little while longer and let tomorrow wait.
Right.
I thought that was a beautiful thing. Do you want to talk a little bit about that poem?
Yeah. Let me pull that one up.
Page 14.
Katie, page what? 14?
14.
Katie was my only granddaughter. I have 4 grandchildren. 3 of them are boys. And Katie comes sort of right there in the middle as the only girl. And the first time she ever saw me, because she was born in Seattle, and the first time she ever saw me that she could, of course, remember, we had talked on the phone for 3 years, but as a 3-year-old, she came to Wadesboro. We met her at Charlotte Douglas Airport, and she came running into my arms as if I was her long lost grandmother that she had just left. And she just was always, and still is, so full of life and so full of imagination. I remember one time she told me, "Oh, Granny, you're losing your imagination," as if that were the worst thing that could happen. And I think she's probably right. That would be the worst thing that could happen. So she was full of imagination and loved to play, and we all played together. And it was just, this is how she always struck me, like a little fairy. And she loved fairies, so she was a fairy child, so to speak. And my daughter's heart, and my daughter, of course, my heart. So enchant us a little while longer and let tomorrow wait. Don't grow up so fast, children. Every time now I see a little child, a little girl, I just thrill to the memory.
Mm-hmm. Kind of on that same theme, on page 5, Little Boys and Turtles.
Oh, yes.
That made me think of my nephew, Boone.
Yes.
But yes, I thought that was a sweet poem. And I didn't, I'm sure you were thinking possibly of your grandsons with that, or.
Yeah, my 2 oldest at that time. And they always had a little box turtle that they captured and made a nest for, and all kinds of things. And so it struck me that little boys and turtles are a lot alike. Mm-hmm. They love to eat, what does I say? Turtles eat worms and dead flies, little boys aspire to. Turtles love muddy water, as do little boys. So there are just a lot of things about turtles and little boys that struck me as being alike.
Mm-hmm. And then you say, "Oh, that little boys grew as slowly as turtles," and that goes without saying. If only we could just kind of pause time for a little bit and just.
What's the song? If I could put time in a bottle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Talked a little bit about one of the reasons I love poetry is how it brings up emotions, and it's sort of like a way to paint an emotion on paper. And I thought you did that so well with Prissy on page 36.
Oh, yes. Prissy was a dog that was actually given to a neighbor of ours who lived on East Wade while we lived on Breslin Street. And Prissy was given to this older woman by her son, but she didn't want to stay there. She wanted to come and stay with my children all the time. And finally, the woman said, "Why don't y'all just keep her?" And I think she didn't want the dog as much as the children did. And my daughter named the dog Prissy. And Prissy would accompany my children all over this town. You remember, Carolina, there was a time in this town where kids could ride bikes all over town and wander through the woods safely. And that's what they did. And this dog would follow them everywhere they went. And then when they grew up and my son went off to school, Prissy would go to those same haunts. They would walk through the woods to the bus stop because the bus didn't stop at our house at that time. They had to go to Old Lylesville Road. And so they'd walk through the woods to the bus stop, and Prissy would walk them to the bus stop, and she'd meet them there in the afternoons. But then when my son went off to college, she'd look for him everywhere. And then she was gone. And my son came home to find her in the woods where she had died. And I could cry just thinking about this boy. And so this is that story of she remembers and she knows someday he'll come and find her here. And as she dreams and waits, the light grows dim, as does her life. For what else is she to do, a dog without her boy?
Yes, it's beautiful. And I'm sure, I hope every child has that experience. But I was lucky enough to have a dog that followed us everywhere too. So it's one of those common themes, I think, that if you've experienced it, it really touches your heart. And it really touched mine. So that was one of my favorites.
And that's the thing you want poetry to do. You want it to speak to the reader. And not all poetry does. Not everybody connects with every poem, but somewhere along the line, you hope to find one or you hope to write one that people can connect with.
Mm-hmm. Another one that I loved a lot of them, so I can't go into everyone, but was Loving Peter Pan on page 47.
Oh, yeah. That's one of my personal favorites.
Oh, really?
Yeah. My whole family loves Peter Pan. We are Peter Pan lovers. We've got every movie ever made about Peter Pan. And all of us, the adults and the children. And can I read this one aloud?
Mm-hmm. I love that.
Flying wingless through the night, fueled by pixie dust and fairy streams, he lights on my windowsill and casts his shadow on my wall and offers me a thimble full of love. With tales of high adventure, he lures me to a land where Indians haunt the woods and pirates sail the seas, and lost boys raise the mighty ruckus till they fall asleep and dream of mothers they no longer know. Time and I move on, but he does not. Then comes the day his shadow doesn't linger on the wall, and a thimble lies empty on the nursery floor, and memory fades the magic times we shared. Yet looking from my window in the night, I see the third star on the right grow bright, while a familiar cloud shape sails across the moon. Then I remember how sweet life was when I loved Peter Pan. Again, this is an evocation of childhood, what we leave behind, the childhood we leave, and yet every now and then something will happen that reminds us of that special time of childhood. Now, there's one error in this poem that my granddaughter pointed out to me. It's not the third star on the right. I think she said it's the second star.
Oh, I did not pick up on
Yeah.
that.
So only a child would probably notice that at this point. But yeah, this is a poem that I love. Excuse me.
Yes, I love that. Laura Morrison Wyatt, she's married now, but she's one of my dear childhood friends, and she loves Peter Pan. And when I read this, I immediately thought of her. And sometimes there's certain nights when the clouds look like the clouds from Peter Pan.
Right.
And she'll call me or I'll call her and we'll say, have you looked at the clouds? They're Peter Pan clouds.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. And then another one of my favorites was Oak Island, 1971. On page
Oh, yes.
15.
Yes. We lived on Oak Island before it was named Oak Island, when we lived at Yopon Beach. Ash was working on the Brown and Root electrical crew down there while they were building the power plant. And yeah, I'll read this one too. We made our home once by the sea, where we could watch the moon dance on the ink black water outside our bedroom window. The wash of waves upon the shore was our lullaby, and cradling in each other's arms, our final evening's joy. Excuse me. We savored the scent of salt in the air as daily we walked on the beach, offering our faces to the caress of wind and sun, and collecting the treasures offered up by the ocean. Music floated to us from a nearby carousel, lending a lyrical pattern of life to life that was our magic charm, and we considered ourselves to be lavishly rich. And thus it was that moon and tide wove themselves into the fabric of our days, enchanting us and making us believe that life and love would always be this way. Those were actual experiences. Not every poem in the book is an actual experience. Some of them just made out of nothing, pulled out of the air. But this was an actual experience. I did look out my bedroom window at night and see the moon, very often a full moon every month on the water. And it just, which is just, unless you've seen that, it's just breathtaking.
Well, definitely, I wanted to be there.
Yeah, yeah.
When I read this poem, I was like, "Oh, I want to be there."
Yeah, it was a special time.
Mm-hmm. What you said that the Peter Pan, loving Peter Pan was one of your favorites, but do you have another favorite that you would?
Yeah, I have. Well, I once wrote in my journal that my poems are like my toys of childhood. I pull them out every now and then and play with them. And I try to leave them alone. Yeah, one of my favorites, gosh, if I could find it, is Twilight Longings. It's on page 37. I don't sit down most of the time to write a poem, by the way. They just usually come. I recently read on a spiritual formation blog that poets and prophets have a lot in common. When a prophet says that the Lord spoke to him, it's much like the inspiration that a poet gets. Which I ate that up. I thought, yes, that's exactly right. Twilight Longings just came to me one evening. Sitting here in the garden in the gloaming, I see the fairies dancing, twinkling in the fading light. Yes, I know there are fireflies in the twilight, not fairies in the gloaming. And yes, I know this blanket round my shoulders is not your embrace, nor the whisper of the wind upon my cheek your kiss. But the coming night beckons and memory beguiles, and God, how I wish they were fairies. And that's one of my favorites.
I like that too. I think it shows, again, like the importance of imagination.
Right.
And thinking about the fairies. I mean, the lightning bugs is fairies or fireflies. And I love fireflies or lightning. I call them lightning bugs.
Because we're Southerners. Of course we call them lightning.
Yeah. But yeah, that I love that too. And kind of letting your imagination take you places that you need to be.
Right.
And having people that you miss or care about be there with you, even if they can't be.
Exactly. Exactly.
I think it's sweet. So the one, like you have a poem in here called "The River Running Through Him,"
right,
which is the title of the book, and it's on. No, I forgot to write down the page. I know it's towards the end.
56. Yeah, it's one of the last poems. I played with this poem for years. I started writing again in earnest in 2008 or 9. And I played with this poem and never could get it right. I wanted to write a narrative poem. And the river has been such an important thing in our family life. When we were first married, didn't have any money, and having our first children, the river's where we went to play. We camped on the river. We spent days on the river. My husband, I used to say that I was his second love. The river was his first love. He used to, before we were married, when he first came back from Vietnam, he would actually pull his boat to work. He worked for CP&L at the time. And he would pull his boat behind his vehicle and drive right to the river after work and go water skiing.
Oh, wow.
And he and his friend Charlie McCormick spent all their spare time water skiing on that river. And they were really good at it too. And so I wanted to write a narrative about the river. And I realized that this poem was not so much our story or my story as it was his story. So this is the one poem in the book that is really his story. And finally, when Sandy pointed out to me, Sandy Bruni, who is a lot, I might say, a mentor for me in writing, pointed out to me that I had too many points of view. I had too many speakers in the poem. I needed to settle on one. I realized that this was really Ash's story. And that's where the title of the book comes from. This river has run through his life, and it ends. He's seen where the river begins in Carolina Hills and where it ends at Carolina Shores. Running through his life on its journey is essential to him as the blood in his veins, anchoring him to this place he calls home. The PD River actually begins in a parking lot in Blowing Rock, North Carolina. A little stream under a parking lot. That's where it begins and flows through the Yadkin Valley all the way to Murrells Inlet, South Carolina. And so it flows through our life as North Carolinians.
Mm-hmm.
In a lot of ways. It has a lot of the history of North Carolina. And in fact, the song Swanee River was originally supposed to be the PD River. Yeah.
Wow.
And that's in some of the books that I read about the river. This is I guess this poem anchors the book. Mm-hmm. In a way. But this was his story. The rest of it's pretty much my story or our story, but this was his story.
That's neat. Let's see. There are a couple other ones. Oh, the very first one I read before I left the church parking lot. Leaving Home.
Yeah.
You wrote this one in 1968.
Right. This was a poem that is based on the street I lived on at growing up in Greensboro, North Carolina. And there was I grew up in my grandmother's house in Greensboro from until I was about 13. And my cousins lived right next door. And so there were four of us. And those were our playmates and basically brothers and sisters. I was an only child. And down at the other end of North Edgeworth Street in Greensboro, which is a very long city block, where the new baseball stadium is now. At the other end of the street was a boy. It was about our age, and we'd come to our house to play. His name was not Clayton Sutton. Clayton Sutton is just a name I pulled out of the air. And this is not about that boy or about me, but it's just a fantasy of what it would have been like as a boy that lived on that street might have left home. So it's based on the fact that that boy lived in his grandmother's house, his boyhood home. Clayton Sutton doesn't live here anymore. He never looked back to see who watched as he closed the door of his boyhood home just up the block from me. His family gone, the girl gone up to Boston. Folks said he'd go to Europe, spend his fortunes there, or lose himself in some artistic dream. But I know he'll sit beside a mountain stream to listen for the answers to the questions he once put to himself and me, sitting in the garden by the wall, and fling pebbles at the answers. He'll gather flowers in a meadow and toss them at the wind, then chop wood for a fire to build his fantasies in. Now, this is just the fantasy of a young woman just having graduated college who wanted to write some poems. And I realized later that some of this was based on a best friend, male best friend that I had. I had to have been, who was killed in Vietnam, second lieutenant killed in Vietnam. He was the one that would put questions to me sitting in the garden. He was a thinker. And so I realized that that was all tied up in there.
Well, I enjoyed the whole book. You mentioned, I think before we got on here, that you're currently working on another book of poems. One thing that I thought after I read the book, a lot of them also have, which I didn't really go into, but they are maybe touch on seasons or the changing of seasons or just nature in general. I thought it would be really neat if you had a book of poems that maybe went through each of the seasons.
Well, the one I'm currently working on is based on my life on Eastview Street. I don't live on Eastview Street, but I walk Eastview Street every day. I walk up down to Eastview from my house and around a block and back down Eastview. And I've been doing that now for about 2 years. Prior to that, my office was on Eastview Street for many years. So there are 2 phases to the book I'm writing now. It's some of the experiences of being a therapist and situations, not people so much as situations encountered in doing therapy. And also now, as a retired person, just what I see walking around there. And there's one poem in this book based on that, and that's November Rain. It came off of Eastview Street. So I'm trying to pull that together in some meaningful way and finish the collection publication.
Well, I look forward to reading it. Well, that's all that I have. Is there anything else that you would like to share, or?
Yeah, I'd like to do a shout out to my book club. Without my book club, this book would not have ever happened. And without my writers club, both of them, actually, I should not exclude them, because our Anson County Writers Club, I've learned a lot through that group, and we inspire each other. It's a wonderful group, and we invite anybody who's interested in writing to come join us. You don't have to be a good writer or a great writer or a proficient writer to join us. I'm certainly not proficient. And my book club, one of the things that got me started writing poetry again were some of the books I read. The book, Annie Freeman's Traveling Funeral, that we read, inspired me to write a poem, and that sort of got me started again. And so both of those groups have encouraged me to publish. And Roe Boothby was constantly, when are you going to publish? When are you going to publish? And my writing club, when are you going to publish? When are you going to publish? So that's what I did. So I have to give a shout out to both those groups for getting me moving.
Wonderful. And also, your book is available on Amazon, but as I told you earlier, I actually saw it on Barnes & Noble, and I thought that was so cool.
It's also available right here out of my front porch. I still have some copies available.
So if you haven't gotten it yet, I highly recommend it. And I believe you will all enjoy it as much as I did.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And I don't know if there is a way for me to see if anybody is commenting or yeah, I don't know. I'm still learning how to do this. So if you haven't, so maybe not. Maybe next time I'll be able to look at the comments and we can have the audience ask questions. Okay. But for now, I believe that's it, unless you have something else. I really appreciate you coming, and hopefully we can do more of this.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Caroline. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I'll see you next time.
Right.
Bye, everybody.